There we go. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for coming out tonight. Um, it's such a treat, even though we're not in person, but just to know that I'm kind of in the Midwest. My father grew up in Illinois in a town on the Mississippi River, a very small town called Fulton, which was across the river from, um, what was the town in Iowa? So fond memories of Illinois. The presentation I'm going to share with you tonight is actually inspired by a walking tour that Washington Walks gives called Women Who Changed America. And I'm actually going to be leading it here in DC in person on Saturday afternoon in celebration of Women's History Month. We created this companion virtual program during Women's History Month during the pandemic. And we've just kept offering it because it's popular and it's such a rewarding program to give. And you might be wondering as you're looking at the title of the program, Blazing a Trail to Capitol Hill, Historic Firsts for Women in Congress. And you might be thinking, boy, it's 2025. Why are we still talking about historic firsts or women being the first of something in Congress? Haven't we kind of gotten by that? Haven't we gotten enough firsts? Well, apparently we haven't. And it's always a good thing to do to be reminded about the trailblazers, the women who kind of got there before everyone else and got it ready for other women to follow them. And I really love this quote from a newspaper article by this woman who is named Sally Jenkins. She's a sports columnist for the Washington Post. And this is an excerpt from an article that she wrote in which she said, well, it might be nice to think that firsts for women don't matter as much as they used to. They still do, for the simple reason that when a woman enters a new space, she changes it, and not just by improving the language and manners at the podium. As former MIT President Susan Hockfield has said, they remove the lurking question of the impossibility of an ambition. On the day that Hockfield assumed the top rung at the research university in 2004, she was stunned to be greeted by female academics with tears streaming down their faces. They told her they thought they'd never live to see it. That's a good reason to celebrate firsts, because sometimes we have lived to see it. And the other thing is that we are still blazing the trail to Capitol Hill. Here's some stats from the election we just had in November of 2024. And this is about women who are now serving in the new Congress. They were sworn in January. So you can see here that we've got total members of the US Senate are 100. And of those 100, 26 are women, 26% of the total seats. You all in Illinois have one. With the House of Representatives, there's 435 total members, 125 are women, 28% of the seats in the House. You all in Illinois have 6. But let's all remind ourselves that women comprise 49.75% of the total US population. We're still blazing the trail. We're not there yet with total equality. Well, speaking of voting, women voters, what might come as a surprise to you is that women were elected to public office before most white women were granted the right to vote. Note the date on this photograph. It's August 18, 1920. That was a landmark day. Women had achieved a right that had never been granted them since the founding of the United States, the right to cast a vote in an election. Yet, another landmark moment for women in American politics had already occurred. And it had to do with this woman right here. The state of Montana elected Jeanette Rankin to Congress in 1916, 4 years before women got the right to vote. The historic election of the first woman to Congress spurred women's hopes that having one of their own in Washington as a surrogate representative would make the passage of a women's suffrage amendment to the Constitution possible. It was while studying at the University of Washington in Seattle that Jeanette Rankin had joined the women's suffrage movement, a campaign that achieved its goal in Washington state already in the year 1910. She became a professional lobbyist for the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and her speaking and organizing efforts on behalf of that organization helped Montana women gain the right to vote already in 1914. Well, when she arrives in Congress, this magazine called The Suffragist published a cover story about her in the March 31, 1917 issue. And you'll see here's an illustration, and the title of it, way at the bottom of the publication, is called Come to Mother. The drawing is portraying Rankin as a mother to women's suffrage. And there's a little girl embodying the proposed 19th Amendment who's reaching to Rankin for nurturing and a supportive embrace because she's the mother. Two women you can see kind of in the background look on, and one of them says, "That child needs a woman to look after her." So there was a lot of expectations on Jeanette Rankin and her role in the Congress. In fact, in the magazine, there was a quote that said, "With Miss Rankin's name set in position on her door in the House office building, women in every part of this nation feel that they have at last a special leader at court. Miss Rankin is a representative at large, not only of Montana, but so far as women are concerned, the whole United States." The pressure on Jeanette Rankin was actually enormous, not only because of this issue of they wanted to get the 19th Amendment passed, but the same day that she is sworn into office, President Woodrow Wilson asks Congress to declare war on Germany, World War I. He wants us to join that war. The First World War had become a big question in early 1917. And back home in Montana, Jeanette Rankin's constituents they had opinions about it. She received a torrent of letters and telegrams asking her to oppose the war. And she understood full well that she represented more than Montana. In a sense, she was going to end up standing in for all American women and would be setting a precedent for those women who would follow her. However, she took a dim view of the war and of the military. Some of that had to do with her sense that women could bring a better sensibility to politics and to international relations. She wasn't an isolationist. She thought America could do good in the world. She just didn't think that sending the Marines in was the best way to do that. So she has this dilemma that she wants to represent her constituents. She wants to be true to her beliefs. She also realizes she's this figurehead for American women. And that's where the woman in this photograph comes in. This is Alice Paul. Alice Paul was then the head of the National Women's Party, an organization that was crucial in getting the 19th Amendment passed. And on the day that Rankin was going to have to go to Congress and vote on whether or not the U.S. should enter World War I, she stayed in her apartment as long as she could before going to the Capitol. And Alice Paul was with her, and Jeanette Rankin was kind of fretting about what she should do. And Alice Paul said to her, essentially, it would be a tragedy to vote for this war. You have an obligation as the first woman in Congress to give voice to a woman's conscience. So what Jeanette Rankin ends up doing is when it's time for her to cast her vote, she stood up, she kind of claps the back of the seat in front of her, and she said, "I want to stand by my country, but I cannot vote for war. Does that mean, the clerk asked her, you vote no? And she said, that is correct. And she sat down. She was one of 50 members who voted against the US entering World War I, but hers was the vote that everybody remembered, and it ruined her chances for being reelected in the year 1918. She is reelected to Congress years later in 1940. And at that time, it coincides with her having to make another vote about a great war, this time World War II. Again, her belief in pacifism, frankly, compels her to vote no on the US entering the Second World War. Well, this time she was the only person in Congress to vote no. But nonetheless, by 1968, she's no longer in Congress, but she actually led a women's march in Washington to protest the war in Vietnam. And her followers called themselves the Jeanette Rankin Brigade. She didn't particularly care for that name. She thought it was too militaristic. But were you ever to, and I hope you can, come to Washington, D.C., visit the U.S. Capitol building, when you get into the main entrance, you will be greeted by the statue of Jeannette Rankin. She's one of many that each state can put two figures into the statuary collection, and Jeannette Rankin is one of the people from Montana. So she's the first woman elected to the House of Representatives. The first woman to be seated in the United States Senate, Georgia's Rebecca Latimer Felton, was considered a pioneering Georgia suffragist, a conservative writer, a widely respected social advocate. She accepted the honorary appointment to the Senate on November 21, 1922. So she's there right after Jeannette Rankin hasn't won re-election. Well, Rebecca Latimer Felton's route to the seat was a bit unconventional. At the time, Georgia Governor Thomas Hardwick greatly opposed women's suffrage, and accordingly, the state had failed to ratify the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. Rebecca Latimer Felton was, it is not an overstatement to say she was a rabid suffragist. This was her issue, or one of her issues. So there was no love lost between her and Governor Hardwick. But then what happens is one of the Georgia senators dies suddenly, and there has to be a special election. So Governor Hardwick, being a very savvy politician, he thinks, I want that Senate seat. I need women to vote for me to get the Senate seat. I don't have a good track record on suffrage, but Rebecca Latimer Felton, she's like their leader. I'll appoint her to take the place of this past deceased senator, and then, we'll have a special election and I'll win. And I've gotten to, women will like me because of Rebecca Latimer Felton's appointment, but then actually I'll get to be the senator. Well, what happens is he doesn't win the special election. And the person who does win it is a gentleman named Walter F. George, who graciously said to Mrs. Felton, well, you were appointed to this as an honorary position, and I think you should be sworn in and serve for a 24-hour stretch. You deserve that honor. So that's what happened. She was 87 years old at the time. She's 87 years old in this photograph. Well, she was an astute businesswoman all her life. She had managed her husband's successful 1874 campaign for the U.S. House of Representatives. He represented North Georgia for 3 terms. She worked as his congressional secretary and advisor. She knew her way around politics. She knew her way around Washington. Her presence on her husband's campaign trail was very unusual at that time for a woman. And I think particularly a Southern woman. And it drew a lot of criticism from their opponents. She later recalled, I did not stop to think what a change this was for a young woman considered only an ornament and a household mistress. I just did it. Well, here's the surprise about Rebecca Latimer Felton. Here's a historic marker in DeKalb County, which is right adjacent to Atlanta in Georgia, kind of telling about her life, how she got to be in the Senate temporarily. She was a writer, had a newspaper columnist, temperance advocate, suffrage person. But what this historical marker, as well as many historical accounts of her life, failed to mention is that she was, even for her time, a white supremacist, a malicious and ferociously outspoken racist who went so far as to actively promote the lynching of thousands of Black men. Felton's racial arrogance was fully highlighted in a jaw-dropping speech that she gave to the Georgia Agricultural Society in 1897. In it, she conflated her racism with women's suffrage, stating that farm wives faced many dangers, but none greater than the threat of Black rapists. Her speech was a hit. According to the Kansas City Journal, at the conclusion of it, the audience rose as if by a single impulse and shouting themselves hoarse and almost delirious, refused to let the speaker go on for several minutes. Rebecca Latimer Felton, you can see by the dates here on this marker, passed away in 1930 at the age of 95. She died in Atlanta. To this day, she is the only woman from Georgia to serve in the U.S. Senate. I'll also point out that DeKalb County, Georgia, nowadays is a predominantly Black county. In 2020, Georgia elected its first Black senator, Raphael Warnock. He's also the first Black Democrat elected to the Senate from a Southern state. This is the woman who was actually elected to the Senate by her own right. And I'm happy to say that she was not a white supremacist. Hattie Wyatt Caraway got to the Senate by a way that many women did get to the Senate and sometimes even could get to the Senate today, or a man could. And that's by something called the widow's mandate. Her husband, Thaddeus, was a member of Congress, and he died suddenly of a heart attack. And the governor of Georgia appointed Hattie Caraway willingly, she wanted to do this, to fill his term in the Senate. She ends up winning by a landslide the special election to fill the seat. And then I think a lot of people at that moment thought, well, this is nice. You know, what an honor for Widow Caraway to, fulfill her husband's obligation in the Senate. But they way underestimated Hattie Caraway. She fully intended to run in the actual election when that happened. And she did, and people were surprised, and not everybody was supportive. But she won decisively in that election and ended up serving in the Senate for many, many years. You can see 1931 to 1945. And during her time, a photographer who, I think this was kind of a moment not expected, but was walking through the halls of the Senate and the Capitol and saw these three women together in, I think, this kind of very sisterly moment, but it's business because these three women, and there's Hattie Caraway with the black and the black hat on, these three women are the first three women who chaired a congressional committee. That had not happened before. And by coincidence, here they all were gathered together in the passageway in the Capitol, and a photographer got a picture of them all together. Well, the first woman to run for the United States presidency And the first woman to serve both in the House of Representatives and in the Senate was this woman, Margaret Chase Smith, from the state of Maine. Only a handful of women held seats in the House of Representatives when she came to Congress in 1940. She had no female colleagues when she joined the Senate in 1949. She actually remained the only female senator to serve as a result of her victory in the general election until the 1960s. So she had a lot of tenacity, and I think had a lot of confidence in herself and her views. In fact, she became known as the conscience of the Senate. More on that in a moment. In 4 terms in the House of Representatives and then 4 in the Senate, Smith won friends and earned foes across a wide political spectrum. She could number among her enemies such polar opposites as the communist hunting Joseph R. McCarthy, as well as the leader of the Soviet Union, then leader Nikita Khrushchev. The formidable Mr. McCarthy referred sneeringly to Smith as Snow White, and Mr. Khrushchev saw her as the devil in the disguise of a woman. Never anything but a Republican, Margaret Chase Smith was hardly the dyed-in-the-wool variety. Party regulars could never take her vote for granted. She voted as she saw fit. And then, in the 1950s, she alienated Joseph McCarthy by joining with 6 other Republican senators in making a declaration of conscience against McCarthy's inquisitorial methods of trying to suppress communism. And this is one of the most famous speeches that man or woman has ever delivered in Congress. And I want to share with you all that speech, but it's going to be delivered in a remarkable way. It's her words, her declaration of conscience. But the Norman Rockwell Museum, which is in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, brought together some actresses to deliver the speech. And I want us all to hear it because, well, it was in 1950 that she made her declaration of conscience, but I think if she stood up and delivered this speech today in the Congress, it would have resonance. See what you think.
I would like to speak briefly and simply about a serious national condition.
It is a national feeling of fear and frustration that could result in national suicide.
And the end of everything that we Americans hold dear.
It is a condition that comes from lack of effective leadership in either the legislative branch or the executive branch of our government.
I speak as a Republican.
I speak as a woman.
I speak as a United States Senator. I speak as an American.
I think that it is high time for the United States Senate and its members to do some soul searching.
For us to weigh our consciences on the manner in which we are performing our duty to the people of America.
On the manner in which we are using or abusing our individual powers and privileges.
Those of us who shout the loudest about Americanism in making character assassinations are all too frequently those who, by our own words and acts,
Ignore some of the basic principles of Americanism.
The right to criticize. The right to hold unpopular beliefs.
The right to protest.
the right of independent thought.
The exercise of these rights should not cost one single American citizen his reputation
Or his right to a livelihood.
Nor should he be in danger of losing his reputation
merely because he happens to know someone who holds unpopular beliefs.
Who of us doesn't? Otherwise,
None of us could call our souls our own.
otherwise,
Thought control would have set in.
the American people are sick and tired of being afraid to speak their minds.
Lest they be politically smeared as communists or fascists by their opponents.
Freedom of speech is not what it used to be in America,
It has been so abused by some
that it is not exercised by others.
As a woman, I wonder how the mothers, wives, sisters, and daughters feel about the way in which members of their families
Have been politically mangled in the Senate debate, and I use the word debate advisedly.
As a United States Senator, I am not proud of the way in which the Senate has been made a publicity platform for irresponsible sensationalism,
I am not proud of the reckless abandon
in which unproved charges have been hurled from this side of the aisle.
As an American, I am shocked at the way the Republicans and Democrats alike
are playing directly into the communist design of confuse, divide, and conquer.
As an American, I don't want a Democratic administration whitewash or cover up.
Any more than I want a Republican smear or witch hunt.
It's high time that we stopped thinking politically as Republicans and Democrats about elections,
And started thinking patriotically as American.
about national security based on individual freedom.
It is high time that we all stopped being tools and victims of totalitarian techniques.
techniques that, if continued here unchecked, will surely end what we have come to cherish as the American way of life.
Wow. Now we're going to hear her voice. She decided in 1964 that she was going to announce her candidacy for the US presidency. And she ran in the New Hampshire primary of that year. This is a little excerpt from her announcement speech.
I find the reasons advanced against my running to be far more impelling. For were I to run, it would be under severe limitations with respect to lack of money, lack of organization, and lack of time because of the requirements to be on the job in Washington doing my elected duty instead of abandoning those duties to campaign, plus the very heavy odds against me. So because of these very impelling reasons against my running, I have decided that I shall.
And she did.
I find the reasons advanced.
Unfortunately, well, you all won't be surprised to hear this because we know we did not have a President Margaret Chase Smith. She lost every single primary election, but Illinois, listen to this. She did manage to win 25% of the vote in Illinois. At the 1964 Republican National Convention, she did become the first woman to have her name placed in nomination for the presidency at a major political party's convention. This is a Time magazine cover that is featuring the first woman of color to be elected to the House of Representatives. And her name was Patsy Takemoto Mink. And you can see that she served twice between 1965 and 1977, and then between 1990 and 2002. She was born in Hawaii and graduated as the valedictorian of her high school. She attended college in Pennsylvania and then at the University of Nebraska. But sadly, she had to transfer because of racial discrimination. All students of color were not allowed to live in the same dorms as the white students. She ends up going back to, she returns to Hawaii and finishes her schooling at the University of Hawaii, and she gets the degrees to become a doctor, and actually starts to go to medical school, applies. She applies to a number of schools. None of her applications are accepted, and she suspects it's because she's female. It also may be because she's a Japanese American. So she's been thwarted with that. So she says, all right, I'll go to law school. I don't really like how things are. Maybe as a lawyer, I can make a difference. So she's accepted actually into a school in Illinois, University of Chicago, gets her law degree, graduates in 1951, hopes to get a job in Chicago. No law firm will hire her. So she moves back to Hawaii, registers for the bar exam to try to get her a license to practice law in Hawaii. And she passed, got her past the bar, couldn't get a job in Hawaii because of her interracial marriage. Her husband was Caucasian. So she decides, okay, I'll start my own law firm. And that's exactly what she did. And she actually became the first Japanese American woman to practice law in the state of Hawaii. But what she is most known for, and some of you may recognize her name and this piece of legislation, was her devoted shepherding of development of what became known as the Title IX legislation. And usually we'll say that about Patsy Mink. We'll say, thank you, Patsy Mink, and kind of end of story where we benefit from that. You know, I as a woman, my daughter as a woman. But until the anniversary of Title IX, which I believe was 2022, I don't think a lot of people knew at what personal cost it came for Patsy Mink. In 2022, the New York Times did a very short 20-minute documentary about her career, but focused on this crucial piece of legislation that she believed in and wholeheartedly wanted passed. But also this documentary shows us and tells us how it almost didn't happen and how she really had to make a searing choice between being a mom and being a member of Congress. This is her with her daughter, Wendy. And in this documentary, we're just going to look at a portion of it. Wendy is narrating, and she's narrating essentially the kind of lead up to a moment when the Congress, House of Representatives, is going to vote on an amendment to the Title IX legislation. And Wendy's narrating because Wendy has a significant role to play in what happened. Here we go.
Included they have been in the past. The individual does count, and we can make an impact.
Her most significant accomplishment is Title IX, which prohibits discrimination against students on the basis of sex. It's not actually new language, it's borrowed language from the Civil Rights Act, which didn't cover gender equality in education. It's the Education Act amendments of 1972. I don't think anybody knew the full effect of those 37 words. Richard Nixon signed the bill into law shortly after the burglars broke into the Watergate. But the story wasn't over. Within months of it becoming law, they became fully aware that there were pretty big implications, specifically for athletics, which led to the enraged awakening of the male athletics lobby. Men who didn't want to share money and men who didn't want women in their sport.
Does equal opportunity mean equal funding?
You're concerned about funding women's athletic programs, is that correct?
Do you think women will ever play collegiate football?
Not at Oklahoma.
We are very concerned.
To the point we feel that it possibly might threaten the program. The women's sports certainly will be non-revenue producing, and naturally I do not feel like total budget should be split equally.
That didn't age well. John Tower was a senator from Texas, and Robert Casey was a representative from Texas, both of whom took on the defense of male athletics. Representative Robert Casey wanted to exempt physical education from coverage under Title IX. The Casey Amendment. If Casey won, There were enormous consequences. Physical education would become the first domino. She wasn't going to let it happen. It was my mother and her allies in Congress waging the fight with legions of feminists lobbying. Casey Amendment is debated. My mother makes an impassioned speech against the Casey Amendment. It was a battle down to the wire. This was the definitive moment for athletics equity. The future of equality in some large way was on the table that day. The vote gets underway. Meanwhile, I got in the car. An oncoming car crashed into us. Phone call comes to her on the floor. Your daughter's unconscious in intensive care. I got the brunt of impact. The ultimate family versus career moment. That my mother was even in the hospital with me, given the stakes of what was happening in Washington, D.C., seems sort of insane to me. The Casey Amendment wins 212 to 211. It lost by 1 vote. My mom's vote. Yes. The windshield flew at me. All the glass fell. It cut my face. Here. Yeah, it's all along here, the side of my mouth. I'm sure the male athletics lobby were celebrating on the night of the 16th, but things were happening. Her colleagues in Congress, especially Congresswoman Abzug of New York, who was a good friend, fought in her absence. Many expressed concern for what was going to happen to me. Even a substantial number of pro-Casey people. Yeah. It was the Speaker's decision, Speaker Carl Albert of Oklahoma. He always said, Patsy and I see eye to eye, because they were both short. I mean, he was a short man. Given my mother's abrupt departure, thought about it, considered it, and decided, revote. Many on the other side came around. So in the end, 215 to 178 in favor of deleting the Casey Amendment from the Education Appropriations Bill. My mom won, girls and women won, feminists won, yes. No person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance.
Moseley with a rebound.
That is called Title IX.
But it was very difficult getting into school and getting into the profession.
This is a woman I think some of you are going to recognize. Carol Moseley Braun. On November 3, 1992, she became the first Black woman to be elected to the United States Senate, defeating Richard S. Williamson. She was also the first woman elected to the U.S. Senate from Illinois and the first African American elected to the U.S. Senate as a Democrat. She was the sole Black in the Senate during her tenure. Well, how did she get there? How did she get to the Senate? In 1992, angered by incumbent Democrat Senator Alan Dixon's vote to confirm Clarence Thomas, despite accusations of sexual harassment from Anita Hill, Carol Moseley Braun challenged Dixon in the primary election for his seat. She fortunately was backed by the political coalition from Hyde Park neighborhood in Chicago that had previously backed campaigns of people like Harold Washington and Jesse Jackson. So she has this resounding victory. She only, as some of you know, she was only a one-term senator. She lost to a gentleman named Peter Fitzgerald, a Republican, in her reelection. She was born in Chicago. She was described always as a self-motivated individual, even as a little girl. As a young woman, she worked in the post office and in grocery stores to finance her education after high school. Like Patsy Mink, she earned a law degree from the University of Chicago. And then she worked for 3 years as a prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office. And she then, in 1978, she went into the Illinois House of Representatives, where she immediately earned a very stellar reputation that she carried with her into the Senate campaign and is able to lead. She's still with us today. She is alive and still talking about politics when asked. So she's the first Black woman in the Senate. Here's the first Black woman to be elected to the House of Representatives. 1968, Shirley Chisholm. She won a newly redistricted seat in Brooklyn. And interestingly, she ran against a Black man named James Farmer, who was a very famous civil rights activist. They had actually similar positions, kind of economically and socially, but the difference was Farmer had the temerity to argue that women, Black women, have been in the driver's seat in Black communities for an extensive period of time, and that their district needed a man's voice in Washington. Well, Shirley Chisholm prevailed. And in 1972, during her second term in the House of Representatives, she declared that she was going to run for the U.S. presidency. Here's just an excerpt from her announcement speech.
I stand before you today as a candidate for the Democratic nomination for the presidency of the United States of America. I am not the candidate of Black America, although I am Black and proud. I am not the candidate of the women's movement of this country, although I am a woman, and I'm equally proud of that. I am not the candidate of any political bosses or fat cats or special interests. I stand here now without endorsements from many big-name politicians or celebrities or any other kind of prop. I do not intend to offer to you the tired and glib cliches which for too long have been an accepted part of our political life. I am the candidate of the people of America.
And indeed, she was. Here's one of her campaign posters. Unbought and unbossed was her famous slogan. And her bid for the presidency was referred to as the Chisholm Trail. She won a lot of support from students, women, minority groups. She entered 11 primaries and campaigned in several states, particularly in Florida, but with little money, it was going to be an uphill climb for her. But overall, people in 14 states voted for Shirley Chisholm for president. After 6 months of campaigning, she had 28 delegates committed to vote for her at the Democratic convention. At that convention, which was in Miami, it was the first major convention in which a Black woman was considered for the presidential nomination. Although she did not win, she did receive 151 of the delegates' votes. Now, Alabaman George Wallace, some of you might recognize his name. He'd won the governorship of the state of Alabama on a platform of segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And he rose to national prominence in 1963 when he appeared on the steps of the University of Alabama to block Black students from attending. He won 5 Southern states as a third-party candidate in 1968 presidential election, promising to end the federal government's attempts at desegregation. And in 1972, he once again ran for president, same year that Shirley Chisholm did. Shirley Chisholm's campaign was a long shot for sure, but Wallace's prospects actually looked pretty decent until this day in this photograph, May 15, 1972 in Laurel, Maryland, just outside of Washington. Would take me, I can drive to Laurel, Maryland in 20 minutes from my house here. Well, at this campaign stop on May 15, he was shot 5 times, and that attack left him permanently paralyzed. Shirley Chisholm responded in an extraordinary way. She visited Wallace in the hospital in Silver Spring, Maryland, where he'd been taken. Her visit to Holy Cross Hospital lasted roughly 15 minutes. She recounted that she told Wallace, "I wouldn't want what happened to you to happen to anyone." And that the governor, she said, cried and cried in response. She added that despite their profound disagreements on fundamental issues like racial equality, she agreed with Wallace's criticisms of the domination of corporate institutions and the unresponsiveness of government to the people. Wallace actually won 2 primary races after the shooting, but that did effectively end his campaign. And it was Senator George McGovern of South Dakota who ultimately won the Democratic nomination. But as some of you might recall, only to lose to incumbent Richard Nixon by a count of 520 electoral votes to 17. But listen to this. 2 years later, George Wallace threw his support behind Chisholm's bill to give domestic workers the right to a minimum wage, marshaling enough support from Southern Democrats to get the bill passed. Shirley Chisholm served a total of 14 years in Congress and made numerous contributions before she made the decision to retire in 1982. She went on to teach college, co-founded the National Political Congress of Black Women. When asked how she wanted to be remembered, Chisholm said, "When I die, I want to be remembered as a woman who lived in the 20th century and who dared to be a catalyst of change. I don't want to be remembered as the first Black woman who went to Congress. I don't even want to be remembered as the first woman who happened to be Black to make the bid for the presidency. I want to be remembered as a woman who fought for change in the 20th century. That's what I want." Well, we have to mention Nancy Pelosi, who is still in the House of Representatives. She started serving in 1987, but her first is that she was the first female Speaker of the House of Representatives. She's also the first person in more than 60 years to serve 2 consecutive terms in the House of Representatives. She's now 84 years old, and just in the past couple months, there's been talk about that she might be getting ready to announce that she's going to resign after this term. We'll see what happens. So we have to talk about the senator from Illinois, Tammy Duckworth, who represents many firsts for women in Congress. She's the first member born in Thailand. She has an American father and a Thai mother of Chinese descent. She's the first female amputee in Congress. As a wounded veteran with a Purple Heart, she has introduced or co-sponsored bills protecting, excuse me, the rights of veterans. In January of 2017, when President Trump accused the Democrats of holding the military hostage over immigration, it was Tammy Duckworth who took to the Senate floor, declaring in a now historic speech, "I will not be lectured about what our military needs by a 5 deferment draft dodger." She's also the first member of the Senate to give birth while in office. Okay, let me say that again. We haven't had a lot of women, but we have had women in the Capitol building. Tammy Duckworth was the first member to give birth while in office. Her daughter Melee was born in April of 2018. Her arrival and that of Duckworth's first daughter, Abigail, inspired her to introduce the Friendly Airports for Mothers Act to compel large and medium airports applying for a grant from the Department of Transportation to include lactation area on site. She's also responsible for getting the Senate to pass a resolution allowing children under the age of 1 onto the Senate floor. As a senator, you must be on the floor in order to cast your vote, which is obviously a lot harder to do when you have a very small child to take care of, and if you're a woman, possibly needing to breastfeed. I want to kind of include these side-by-side images because it's kind of like the next era she represents. Famous photograph of President Kennedy with the Resolute desk, which has this little compartment that his little boy John Jr. is having a good time in the Oval Office. And here's Senator Duckworth in her office with one of her own daughters kind of peeking out from underneath the desk. But a very different thing when it's a mother behind the desk. And probably also very different that a mother who has a Purple Heart from being in the military. Of course, President Kennedy also was wounded when he was in the military, but I love the juxtaposition of these two photos. So we get to conclude with 2 new firsts, or maybe it's kind of one first. And this is a result of the election that we just had in November of 2024. Senator Angela Alsobrooks of Maryland and Lisa Blunt Rochester of Delaware made history in that election as the first Black women to serve in the U.S. Senate at the same time. So unlike Carol Moseley Braun, who was by herself as a Black in the Senate, unlike Margaret Chase Smith, who was by herself for many times, many years, as the lone female, these 2 Black women are both in the Senate together in a sisterhood. And we'll leave with this quote from Jeanette Rankin in our minds. Take this into the evening with us and to Women's History Month. Thank you so much for sharing this presentation with me in this time. And if anyone has any questions you want to put in the chat, I am very, very happy to answer them. But keep in mind, I'm a tour guide, not a historian.